It didn't start with a headline. It started with something far more dangerous inside a closed circle of staffers. A list that was never meant to exist, quietly circulating like a whisper with teeth, names disappearing from it one by one, and nobody willing to admit who was pulling them out. And once that detail leaked out, everything else suddenly looked less like isolated chaos and more like a pattern someone had tried very hard to keep buried. Australia wasn't reacting like a crowd, it was reacting like a calculator that refused to flatter anyone anymore, and that's where the first crack appears. Because behind all the public noise, behind all the polished appearances and carefully staged moments, there is this cold statistical sting that refuses to go away. A 1,700-person snapshot that doesn't shout, doesn't protest, it just sits there quietly dismantling the illusion piece by piece. But the real tension didn't stay outside. It started leaking inward. Because while the public was arguing over optics, something else was allegedly moving behind closed doors. A VIP cancellation list, not officially acknowledged, not publicly confirmed, but reportedly seen by multiple staffers in fragments, screenshots, half-glimpsed documents that were never supposed to leave internal systems. Names crossed out, names reshuffled, names quietly removed after certain conversations that nobody wants to put on record, and that's where things get uncomfortable. Because cancellation lists don't usually become gossip unless something about them feels reactive, almost defensive, like adjustments being made in real time to something that isn't going according to plan. What makes it worse is how calm everything looks on the surface while these internal whispers keep multiplying underneath it. Publicly, it's still framed as engagement, appearances, structured visits, controlled access. But internally, the story being whispered is something far more chaotic. A shifting guest dynamic, sudden removals, last-minute reshuffling that allegedly left even some staff confused about who was still actually attending what. And that confusion didn't stay contained. It started bleeding into the numbers. Because once you start aligning the cancellations with the attendance gaps, the picture begins to distort in a way that no official statement really addresses. One moment it's sold-out projections, the next it's downsized seating, and then suddenly it's conversations about who was supposed to be in the room versus who actually showed up. And that gap between expectation and reality becomes its own kind of story. And in that gap, the alleged VIP cancellation list takes on a different meaning entirely. Not just names being removed, but names being strategically absent. Almost like the guest list itself was breathing, adjusting, reacting to something happening off-record. And while all of this is circulating in fragments, another layer quietly slips in. Internal frustration reportedly tied to communication breakdowns, last-minute changes, and staff allegedly trying to manage expectations that were already slipping out of alignment with what was being delivered on the ground. That's where the tone shifts, because when internal documents stop matching external messaging, it stops being just a scheduling issue and starts looking like something being actively managed in real time to prevent contradiction from surfacing. And then comes the part nobody agrees on, a rumor inside the rumor, that certain cancellations weren't just administrative, they were selective. That specific attendees were quietly removed from priority access, replaced or redirected depending on internal pressure points that no one is officially explaining. And that's when the phrase VIP cancellation list stops sounding like a harmless internal tool and starts sounding like a control mechanism that someone is very carefully trying not to acknowledge. Because once you combine the shifting attendance stories, the conflicting reports from guests, the discrepancies between what was promised and what people claim they experienced, and this alleged list moving silently through staff channels, the narrative stops behaving like isolated incidents and starts behaving like a system under strain, a system adjusting itself quietly, too quietly. And the most unsettling part isn't what's being said out loud, it's what keeps not being denied directly, because silence in situations like this doesn't read as neutrality anymore. It reads like containment, and containment always suggests there's something still inside that could spill if pressure builds just a little higher, which brings everything to the edge of a far sharper question nobody is officially asking yet. If names were being removed from access lists behind the scenes, then who was deciding the removals? And why does every version of the story seem to shift depending on who is speaking? Because somewhere between the polished appearances and the fragmented leaks, A structure is forming that doesn't fully match any single public explanation, and that structure is where the real tension begins. And just as the whispers about the list start to settle into something heavier, something even more contradictory surfaces from inside the same environment, suggesting that the cancellation pattern might not be random at all, but connected to timing decisions that only become visible when you look at everything at once. Which is exactly when the story takes a turn nobody in the room seems ready for yet. And that's where part 1 stops. Because what comes next in the background of this VIP cancellation list isn't just confusion anymore. It's alignment. And alignment always means someone, somewhere, was coordinating more than they admitted. Because once alignment enters the picture, the whole story stops behaving like scattered gossip and starts feeling like something more deliberate. Something stitched together so carefully that the seams only show when enough separate voices start describing the same invisible pressure from different angles. The alleged VIP cancellation list at this stage is no longer just a piece of internal chatter. It becomes the center of gravity for everything else people are whispering about behind the scenes. And what makes it unsettling isn't just the idea that names were being removed, it's the way those removals allegedly followed a pattern that nobody can fully explain without contradicting someone else's version of events. Some staffers, according to the circulating fragments, describe last-minute shifts where certain attendees who were expected at high-priority seating suddenly vanished from check-in lists without formal explanation. Others insist it was simple logistical reshuffling, nothing unusual in large-scale events. But then there are those quieter voices, the ones that don't want to be quoted at all, hinting that the list wasn't just about seating, it was about visibility, access, and control over who got close enough to the core moments to even be counted as present in the narrative. And that's where things start to feel less like event management and more like narrative management. Because when you combine removal patterns with timing inconsistencies, a strange shape begins to emerge, almost like someone was adjusting the audience in real time depending on how the event was unfolding externally. Not officially confirmed, not publicly acknowledged, but persistently echoed in fragments that refuse to fully disappear, no matter how many times they're brushed off. Then comes the next layer, the one that turns whispers into something sharper. Reports, still unverified, suggest that internal communication channels were unusually active in the hours leading up to key appearances, with repeated references to updates, adjustments, and final confirmations that allegedly kept changing even after guests believed everything had already been finalized. And within that shifting structure, the alleged VIP cancellation list appears again, not as a static document, but as something fluid, something edited, something that kept evolving in sync with external pressures. And this is where suspicion deepens, because lists don't usually behave like that unless something about the underlying situation is unstable. But instability alone doesn't explain the emotional tone that begins to creep into these accounts. Some describe confusion, others frustration, and a few describe something closer to disbelief, as if what they were seeing didn't match what they had been told just hours earlier. A guest expecting premium access suddenly downgraded. Another told they were moved for coordination reasons without further detail. Another quietly removed from a priority grouping entirely, only to reappear in a general admission pool later, as if nothing had happened at all. Each change on its own looks minor. Together, they start to feel coordinated. And then there's the silence from official channels, which only makes the internal noise louder. Because when nothing is directly addressed, every fragment begins to carry more weight than it should. A missing confirmation becomes a signal. A reshuffled name becomes a clue. A deleted note becomes a story in itself. At the same time, public-facing commentary continues as if nothing underneath is unstable. Appearances proceed, statements remain controlled, and the external narrative stays polished enough to avoid acknowledging any internal friction. But the gap between internal chatter and external messaging grows wider with every passing mention of that alleged cancellation list. And somewhere in that widening gap, a more uncomfortable idea starts to form. That the list itself might not just be a symptom of disorganization, but a tool being used to manage perception in real time, adjusting access to match evolving priorities that are never openly declared. Of course, none of this is confirmed. That's what keeps it suspended in this uneasy space between rumor and pattern. But gossip doesn't need confirmation to spread. It only needs repetition, and this particular detail keeps reappearing in slightly different forms from slightly different angles, always pointing back to the same unresolved center. Even more intriguing is how quickly discussions around it get redirected elsewhere whenever they approach anything too specific, almost as if the closer people get to the alleged list's origin or decision-making process, the faster the conversation shifts back to safer ground. And that behavior itself becomes part of the story, because avoidance is still a response. And in narratives like this, avoidance can sometimes speak louder than disclosure. By the time everything is stitched together, the shifting guest accounts, the contradictory timelines, the internal restructuring claims, and the persistent reference to a VIP cancellation list that no one officially wants to own, the picture that forms isn't clean and it isn't complete, but it is undeniably dense with tension. Not proof, not confirmation, but pressure. And pressure in stories like this is often the first sign that something beneath the surface is still moving, still adjusting, still reacting to forces that haven't fully come into view yet. And so the story doesn't resolve. It settles into something more uncomfortable instead. The feeling that the list everyone keeps talking about might not be the real headline at all. The real headline might be why so many different people are describing different versions of the same invisible list, and why none of those versions ever quite match up when pulled into the same room. And that mismatch is where the uncertainty keeps growing, even after everything else has supposedly been explained away.